For a deep dive into the future of Ethereum, please welcome to the stage researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, Danny Ryan.
Hello. Wow. My name's Danny Ryan. I work at the Ethereum Foundation. I'm on the research team. I work a lot on research, specifications, a little bit of client development, and a lot of client coordination around Ethereum 2.0. This is what I usually stand on the stage and talk about. Fortunately, Akila and Jim talked about it this morning. This thing is really cool. This is highly scalable, decentralized, doesn't compromise, and I truly believe is going to change the world. But instead, today I'm going to talk about more abstractly the implications of this technology and maybe some of the things we should be thinking about and concerned about with respect to this technology. So approximately 10 years ago, Bitcoin comes out, blockchain. It's something like this. We have this new tool, but we're not quite sure how to use it. We're not quite sure what to do with it. It's a little heavy, and we're still figuring it out. As time goes on, we start getting the vision. We start understanding a little bit more what this is going to look like, but still, again, trying to figure out how to make it go. More recently, maybe we're at this stage where we have the tools. We know how to use them. We're piling a bunch of people on, and it can get us somewhere, but maybe not so fast and definitely not safe. Maybe more optimistically, this is where we're at. The car goes pretty fast. It gets us where we want, but it doesn't have seatbelts, doesn't have airbags, and if you get in a wreck, the steering column's going to probably go straight through your sternum. So maybe this is Ethereum, and this is Bitcoin right now. But more importantly, we're still on a trajectory. We're not really where we're ultimately going. The car isn't self-driving. We're not in space. But from my perspective, and from probably many of your perspectives here, it's not really a matter of if, but it's more a matter of when and how. When are these technologies going to be fully adopted, and how are they going to manifest? Are the decentralized ideals that spawned most of this, are they going to be held, or are they going to be, instead, are these new networks going to be co-opted by the powers that be and become highly regulated? The current trajectory of Ethereum is that I am generally optimistic that these technologies, at least the Ethereum technology, will not be co-opted and highly regulated. But there's a lot of unknowns in the space, and if we look at some past communication technologies, radio, telephone, and even the networks that have been built on the internet, it doesn't really bode well, because most of these things became highly monopolistic and highly controlled by the government. So a quick little aside. If you know me, you probably know this, but if you don't know me very well, I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm super skeptical of a lot of technological progression. From my perspective, it's inevitable. Obviously, we can't really stop this, barring some widespread human catastrophe. But given the current trajectory and the current unstoppable trajectory, my Ludditism is actually why I've been drawn into this space, because I'm so concerned with the current trajectory and the lack of privacy, and especially on the consumer technology side. I think we're all just being used and highly abused by these few entities at the top. And so blockchain for me and the decentralized space is just, it's this potential ability to maybe change the optimization function, change the trajectory, and maybe take control back of these networks and put them back in our hands. So here's an interesting quote. There has been fierce fighting over the control of the land, and the control of the ether is the most important of all. Interestingly, this is a quote from 100 years ago. The rest of the quote is, "For the power that rules the wireless waves will shape the sentiments of the world." This is about radio. And this is about, in the early 1900s, there was this incredibly utopian vision of radio. The early adopters, the hobbyists, had this notion that this new thing they were calling broadcasting was going to radically change the world, and it was going to open up technology, it was going to open up the communications, it was going to strip the power from the powers that be, and give the common man a voice, and have no one be able to stand in between him and that voice. And this utopian ideal was also around in telephony. So like early telephone networks, there were some like independent telephone networks where farmers were running like wire on their fences between each other, and they were having this like utopian communication medium, and people thought that it was going to change everything, and it did change everything, but it didn't change the power structures and the control. So there's some other interesting quotes from that time. Day and night, the ether is filled with health talks and fairy tales, sermons and sports, music and market reports broadcasted indiscriminately. Nobody can stop him or charge him a cent for eavesdropping the ether. Another one that I like, the invention of radio has turned the nation into a town meeting, but there's no chairman and no parliamentary law. This will bring anarchy in the ether. And so you can really get this notion of like, they're talking about radio, but you could be talking about blockchains and a lot of this. Like, you radically can like reorganize people. You can like bring anarchy to what was like previously fully structured. And so this is the sentiment in the early 1900s. And then we had this inflection point. There was in 1921, this was the World Championship boxing match between Dempsey, the heavyweight champion from the US, and Carpentier, the heavyweight champion from France. People were like super fired up about this match. Carpentier was like pretty cocky and coming over to the US for this fight. And the fight in person had about 80,000 people watching it. But more importantly, a young man convinced them to try experimenting with broadcasting. And so you can see this guy, he's speaking into a telephone, and there's a wire running from the match all the way to the building next door, up to the top of the building, to this like super sketchy, shoddy, like rigged up antenna system. And they broadcast it to what they claimed was the largest audience in history. It's about 300,000 people listened to this. And this guy broadcast blow by blow, for the first time ever, a boxing match. And at this point, this is fascinating because like it's a use of early technology, but more importantly, this caught the public by storm. People previously had kind of heard of radio, like, okay, yeah, you can, but this particular event and some isolated events similarly at that time, they changed people's worldview. So all of a sudden, like, my perception of reality literally has changed because I can now interact with boxing matches or like news or radio, all sorts of like, in a totally fundamentally different way. And so people often view this boxing match as an inflection point in which the public began to have a new relationship with this technology. And so we've had a few of these moments in Ethereum. CryptoKitties is actually near, I know it's kind of a punchline in some respects, but it's near and dear to my heart because I saw firsthand this inflection point with someone near and dear to my heart. So my wife actually, she's incredibly supportive, but hadn't really like, I was just kind of ranting at her about Ethereum and blockchain and stuff, and she was never fully had taken the deep dive to see what the hell was going on here. But I was sitting at a coffee shop one morning doing some work, and I texted her just no words at all. I texted her the link to the CryptoKitties domain. 5 minutes later, she responds, how do I get a wallet? I sent her the link to MetaMask. 10 minutes later, she responds, how do I get Ether? I sent her a little bit of Ether. She and our neighbor, also not a crypto person, spent the next 10 days like operating a relatively successful breeding farm. Here, I'll give you a little taste. So we have Sailor Meows. May or may not be her username. Introduce you to Fuzz Aldrin, Kitty Purry, and last but not least, Vitalik Kidron. And yes, they had fun like playing with kitties and like doing the whole thing online, but actually, like, they started understanding digital scarcity. They started understanding, like, actually owning a digital asset rather than just interacting with something that somebody else owns. They started, like, interacting with decentralized markets, and actually did some pretty impressive stuff. At the time, they were understanding, like, the flooded gas markets, trying to figure out how to price gas, and then most impressively, they started understanding nonces, which hopefully our users at the end of the day don't have to do this, but they learned that transactions have to be sequential, and that if your nonce doesn't go through, if one transaction of a nonce doesn't go through because of the high gas price, you have to go into my Ether wallet and, like, surgically replace the transaction on the network to unflood the network. And anyway, it was very cool, and it was really like seeing firsthand one of these aha moments and these inflection points. I don't know if it grasped, if 300,000 people played this game. I'm sure somebody actually does know that, but it did feel like one of these moments where, like, the general public is beginning to interact with the new technology and fundamentally change their worldview. We had another one of these in the Ethereum space, and it was the ICOs. There's definitely some good and some bad. More abstractly, the inflection point here and the way people were changing their reality was they realized they could, without a third party, exchange some digital asset or money for ownership or participation in something without having a bank and having all sorts of paperwork and things sitting in the middle. And so from that, it was this worldview changing thing, but obviously it was also a scammer's paradise. I think probably a number of you even, that was your foray in here, and I hope that even though there's a lot of negativity probably associated with this time period, it also really was an inflection point in bringing people on board. So these inflection points are prescriptive in that we should probably attempt to foster them and to utilize them in such a way that we use them as onboarding and use them as education, but they're a little bit cautionary as well. I'll read you this quote from like in 1922, right after the big fight, and this was beginning to be the sentiment. It will be a question whether the providing of ethereal amusement and information will be taken over as a governmental function or will become commercialized and fall into the hands of department stores and advertising agencies. In either cases, there are difficulties and dangers ahead. And so at this inflection point, we also started to have big business come in and regulation come in. So right around the same time, RCA was formed, and RCA was like, okay, we're gonna do this. At the time, AT&T was the enshrined, like governmental enshrined monopoly on telephones, and RCA was like, we're gonna do it. We're gonna be big. And so they immediately got in bed with AT&T. They were the only people allowed to broadcast along the long lines, radio broadcast along the long lines in the country, and quickly started gobbling up the radio and airwaves. And soon after, by 1930, they had gotten in bed with government, and what had previously been a landscape of hundreds of low-power radio broadcasts all over the country became such that there were only 40 bandwidths available and only high-power broadcasts. And so at this point, RCA and the government worked together to essentially enshrine RCA as the monopoly. And it totally changed the landscape of radio, and the utopian ideals that we saw previously were pretty much shattered. And the most cautionary tale from the radio story is AM versus FM. So we have amplitude modulated radio, and we have frequency modulated radio. At the time, everything was AM radio, and AM radio is the less superior technology. It doesn't have the same fidelity, and it takes a lot more energy to broadcast. But by 1935, FM radio was actually ready to go to production. But RCA saw that FM radio was ready to go to production, and they got scared. And so they started a FUD campaign, and they took control of the narrative, and they convinced not only consumers, but the government that not only was FM not ready yet, but it was potentially dangerous. And at this time, from 1935 all the way to 1942, FM radio was not only not regulated, but it was actually illegal. Like, you could not broadcast FM radio. And at the same time, they also didn't, RCA was the only manufacturer of the radio receivers, so they didn't put in FM capabilities there. So it did become legal, yet highly restricted and regulated after 1942. But because of the FUD campaign and because of the control of the receivers, FM radio, the superior technology by any standard, was not really fully adopted until the late 70s, even early 80s. So they got to kick the can down the curb on this technology for decades, which is something we need to keep in mind. And take a look at the internet. So this is ARPANET, which was the precursor to the internet. It's the first packet-switched network, and highly using the AT&T's telephone lines. And you can see the progression, 69, 70, 72, 77. It's increasingly bringing on some government agencies and some of these academic institutions. But in 78 was actually when 2 grad students created TCP/IP, because there were 3 packet switch networks at the time. There was this kind of semi-public network, and then there was a satellite network, and there was a radio network, but none of them could talk to each other. So they invented TCP/IP to create, instead of in the past when someone controlled the physical hardware and the networks, they said, we're never going to control all these physical networks. Let's instead put an abstraction on top, TCP/IP, so that regardless of the network, things can communicate, and thus the internet. And so it was a little bit different compared to telephone, compared to radio, compared to television, in that they conceded we're not going to control the physical network, and so we're going to create an abstraction to have a more decentralized landscape on top of the controlled networks. And it's actually worked pretty well. And you had some of the same utopian ideals that we did with radio. With television, never really had the utopian ideals. Film, some other things. But, and the World Wide Web came out in the 90s, and we had this ideal started manifesting more in the consumer. We had some great websites like Jesse's skiing page. I hope that it did become the best ski site on the web, but I'm not really sure where that went. Also, we got Cigar Dude smoking room. And this is like the manifestation of like people just going on, communicating, building whatever they want, and using this like open new network. And it did feel a little bit utopian. But we had one of these inflection points, probably around, we'll call the dot-com boom, where business as usual, the powers that be in government start stepping in. This guy and some other people, they showed up in that decade of the 2000s. And although the internet below is a decentralized medium, they began to build very large centralized networks, Facebook, etc. And more recently, these monopolies, I'm going to call them, on the networks, these very centralized monopolistic networks built on top of the internet, are starting to get in bed with government. And so this was about a year ago in the Senate hearing where Mark Zuckerberg was questioned by the Senate. And I didn't watch a lot of this, but I just like flipped through it and I caught this little bit where Senator Graham is talking to Mark Zuckerberg about all sorts of stuff, and he starts talking about regulation. And he's like, do you think you should be regulated? It seems like you can't self-regulate. It seems like you're a monopoly. And Mark Zuckerberg's like, well, we welcome the right regulation. And it's kind of this weird back and forth in which Senator Graham finally asks the question. He's like, will you submit some proposed regulations? And Mark Zuckerberg, like jumping for joy, says one word, absolutely. And so this is the kind of moment where a monopoly that exists all of a sudden becomes entrenched. And this regulation, like, sure, it's going to make life a little bit harder for them, but it actually makes life almost impossible for the players that don't exist yet and might want to come in and disrupt the system. This is actually the link at that timestamp. It's like 30 seconds before, and it's a really interesting exchange. You should check it out. So, So what about Ethereum? And what about these decentralized technologies? And where do they fit into this? Where do they fit into all this? So the internet was something new and something special in that nobody could control the actual physical network. But come these centralized players that built more abstract networks on top of this decentralized network, we kind of ended up as business as usual. Enter Ethereum and decentralized technologies in general. I think we have the true opportunity to utilize the decentralized infrastructure below to build and take back our networks and build actual decentralized networks on top that cannot be co-opted by the powers that be and cannot be highly regulated. I am worried that if we cut corners, and I'm worried that if we make sacrifices, and I'm worried that if some of these players that are going for the gold in the sense that they make sacrifices in their consensus, or they even like welcome regulation, if they go that route, then they may win out, and all of a sudden we're going to have business as usual. We're going to have a few key players that are controlling these networks, and we're not going to really change the trajectory. We're not going to really change anything for the better. Yes, we'll have new ways to interact, but it's going to be the same old shit. And so with Ethereum, we need to do a few things. We need to move quickly because we don't want to be the FM to this radio. We don't want the inferior technology to take over for some amount of time, only for the actual decentralized technology to come in decades later. We need to work on education. In terms of FUD and things like that, I don't want us to be the FM, but being very reactionary is probably not the right way, but working on education and working on understanding and why these technologies are the way they are and why they should be decentralized is very important. And also not cutting corners. Although we need to move quickly, as we build the current Ethereum mainnet and as we build Ethereum 2.0, we can't cut corners just to get there because otherwise it's going to be business as usual. In that light, so Consensus has a new grants program that I'm very excited about. Ethereum had a grants program launch about a year ago, Ethereum Foundation, Malik DAO. There's a lot of movement to fund public goods and to like get this shit moving but in a decentralized and scalable way. And I'm pleased and honored to be announced two of the grant winners from the first program. The first is the African Blockchain Developer Alliance developer program, the African Blockchain Developer Program, which is working on developer outreach across the continental Africa. It's very exciting. Congratulations, guys. And secondly, to announce that Lighthouse is receiving a consensus grant for building their Ethereum 2.0 client. This is Sigma Prime. It's a team out of Sydney. And so both of these kind of in line with the talk. We need to work on education. We need to build scalable decentralized solutions. Anyway, thank you. Appreciate it.